What if the way you understand yourself is quietly influencing the way you experience your entire life? Why do some people remain trapped in the same patterns, while others seem to change their direction completely? Can becoming more aware of your thoughts, emotions, habits, and reactions actually change the way you make decisions? And perhaps the most important question: how much of your daily life are you living consciously, and how much are you simply repeating without noticing? In this educational summary of The Power of Awareness by Neville Goddard, we are going to explore the idea of awareness from a practical and reflective perspective. But this is not going to be about blindly accepting every claim associated with the book. Instead, we will carefully focus on the ideas that can help us understand self-awareness, attention, mindset, personal responsibility, emotional control, and the way our repeated thoughts can influence our behavior and decisions. Think about this for a moment. If you constantly expect failure, how might that expectation affect the choices you make? If you become aware of a harmful habit, does recognizing it give you a better opportunity to change it? And if you learn to observe your thoughts instead of automatically reacting to every thought, could that create more space between an emotion and your response? These are the kinds of questions we will explore throughout this summary. You will discover why awareness can be the first step toward meaningful personal change, how our internal patterns can influence our actions, why attention matters, and why understanding yourself can help you make better decisions. We will also examine an important distinction: having a thought is not the same as proving that the thought is true. Our goal is not to present imagination or positive thinking as a guaranteed method for obtaining anything we want. Instead, we will look at awareness as a practical tool for examining our thoughts, beliefs, habits, and responses more carefully. You may also discover why simply knowing something intellectually is not always enough. You can know that a habit is harmful and still repeat it. You can understand the importance of patience and still become impatient. You can know what you should do and still struggle to act. So what creates the difference between knowing and actually changing? That question becomes one of the most interesting ideas in this entire journey. As we continue, we will explore how awareness can help us notice patterns, question automatic reactions, strengthen self-control, and make more deliberate choices. And there is one more question worth keeping in mind until the end. What could change in your life if you became more conscious of the thoughts and behaviors you currently take for granted? The answer may not be a magical transformation. It may be something more practical, and perhaps more valuable. A better understanding of yourself. So stay with us until the end, because by the time we finish, you will have a clearer framework for understanding awareness, thought, behavior, and personal responsibility, and you may begin noticing your own patterns in a completely different way. Welcome to the power of awareness. Before we can change our behavior, improve our decisions, or develop greater self-control, we first need to notice what is happening within us. This is where awareness becomes important. Awareness can be understood simply as the ability to notice our thoughts, emotions, habits, reactions, and surroundings without automatically being controlled by them. Think about how often people act without consciously examining what they are doing. A person becomes frustrated and immediately responds harshly. Someone feels nervous and avoids an important responsibility. Another person receives criticism and instantly becomes defensive. These reactions can happen so quickly that there is barely any space between the feeling and the action. But awareness can create that space. Instead of immediately reacting, we can pause and ask, what am I feeling? Why am I reacting this way? Is my interpretation accurate? What response would actually be useful? That small pause can change the quality of a decision. This does not mean that every thought or emotion is wrong. Emotions provide information, and thoughts can help us solve problems. The important point is that we do not have to treat every thought as an unquestionable fact or allow every emotion to determine our behavior. A thought can appear without requiring immediate action. For example, imagine receiving a message that sounds critical. Your first reaction might be, they are disrespecting me. If you immediately respond from that assumption, the situation may become worse. But awareness allows you to pause and consider another possibility. perhaps the message was poorly worded, perhaps you misunderstood it, or perhaps there is additional information you do not yet know. The pause creates an opportunity for better judgment. This is one reason self-awareness is closely connected with personal responsibility. Once we notice our patterns, we become better positioned to decide how we respond to them. Consider a person who repeatedly procrastinates. Without awareness, they may simply say, "I'm lazy." But that label does not explain the actual pattern. With greater observation, they might discover that they avoid tasks when they feel uncertain, overwhelmed, or afraid of making mistakes. That discovery changes the question. Instead of asking, "Why am I such a failure?" they can ask, "What happens immediately before I start avoiding this task?" Now the behavior can be examined rather than simply judged. Perhaps the task needs to be divided into smaller steps. Perhaps the person needs clearer instructions. Perhaps they need to reduce distractions or establish a specific routine. Awareness does not automatically solve the problem. But it can reveal where the problem actually begins. Another important idea is that repeated attention can influence behavior. What we repeatedly focus on can affect what we notice, what we remember, and which choices seem important to us. For example, someone who constantly looks for evidence that people dislike them may notice every small sign of disagreement while overlooking positive interactions. Their attention can reinforce a particular interpretation of their social environment. This does not mean that thoughts magically control reality. It means that attention can influence our perception and behavior. If we become aware of this pattern, we can begin asking more balanced questions. Am I noticing only the negative evidence? Could there be another explanation? What facts do I actually know? These questions can help reduce automatic conclusions. Awareness is therefore not simply positive thinking. In many situations, it requires honest observation. Sometimes awareness reveals qualities we would rather not see. We may notice impatience, jealousy, insecurity, defensiveness, or a tendency to avoid responsibility. The purpose is not to become ashamed of ourselves. The purpose is to understand the pattern well enough to improve it. A person cannot correct a behavior they refuse to acknowledge. This is why self-awareness requires honesty and humility. We need enough confidence to recognize our weaknesses without allowing those weaknesses to define our entire identity. There is also an important difference between observing yourself and constantly judging yourself. Self-observation asks, "What is happening?" Self-judgment often asks, "What's wrong with me?" A healthier approach is to examine behavior as information. If you made a poor decision, ask what influenced it. If you lost your temper, ask what triggered the reaction. If you failed to complete something important, ask what prevented you from following through. These questions turn mistakes into opportunities for learning. Another useful practice is paying attention to the situations in which your behavior changes. You may behave differently when you are tired, under pressure, around certain people, or facing uncertainty. Recognizing these conditions can help you prepare for them. For instance, someone may notice that they make impulsive decisions whenever they are emotionally overwhelmed. Once they recognize this pattern, they can create a simple rule: important decisions should wait until emotions have settled and the relevant information has been reviewed. That is awareness becoming practical discipline. Ultimately, the first lesson is simple. You cannot deliberately change what you do not notice. Awareness gives you the ability to observe your internal patterns before they automatically become actions. It does not promise instant transformation. It gives you something more practical, a clearer understanding of what is happening inside you. And once you can see a pattern clearly, you have a better opportunity to decide whether that pattern deserves to continue. Awareness becomes even more powerful when we begin to understand the relationship between thoughts, emotions, beliefs, and actions. A person may believe that behavior simply happens in response to circumstances, but often there is a sequence taking place beneath the surface. Something happens. We interpret it. That interpretation creates an emotional response. The emotion influences our behavior. Then our behavior produces a result. Understanding this sequence can help us make better choices. Imagine two people receiving the same criticism. One immediately becomes angry and sees the criticism as a personal attack. The other pauses and considers whether there is useful information in what was said. The external event is similar, but their interpretations are different, and therefore their responses may also be different. This does not mean that every negative situation is caused by our thinking. Real problems exist, other people's behavior matters, and circumstances can genuinely be difficult. Awareness simply helps us identify which part of the situation is within our control. We cannot control every event. We cannot control every person's opinion. We cannot control everything that happens around us. But we can often influence how carefully we interpret a situation and how deliberately we respond. This distinction is extremely important. When people believe that everything is outside their control, they may become passive. When they believe that they can control everything, they may become frustrated when reality does not cooperate. A healthier approach is to recognize the difference between influence and control. You can influence your preparation, your effort, your communication, your habits, and your decisions. But you cannot guarantee how another person will respond or exactly what result will occur. This understanding creates a more realistic form of personal responsibility. Another important part of awareness is recognizing repeated beliefs. People often develop beliefs about themselves through past experiences. Someone who failed several times may begin thinking, "I'm not capable." Someone who experienced rejection may begin thinking, "People will always reject me." Someone who was frequently criticized may become extremely afraid of making mistakes. These beliefs can become powerful because they influence what people expect from future situations. But a belief is not automatically a fact simply because it has been repeated for years. Awareness allows us to examine it. Ask yourself, where did this belief come from? What evidence supports it? What evidence challenges it? Is it helping me make better decisions, or is it limiting my behavior? This process does not require pretending that everything is positive. It requires becoming more accurate. If you made a mistake, you can acknowledge it without concluding that you are incapable of improvement. If someone rejected one idea, you can accept that rejection without assuming that every future idea will fail. If you experienced a difficult period, you can recognize what happened without allowing that experience to become a permanent definition of your identity. Awareness creates room for a more balanced understanding. Another important lesson is attention. What receives your attention repeatedly can become more noticeable in your life. If you constantly focus on problems, you may become highly sensitive to negative information. If you deliberately pay attention to solutions, opportunities to improve may become easier to recognize. Again, this does not mean that attention magically changes external reality. It means that attention affects what information you notice and how you respond to it. Consider learning a new skill. At first, you may notice how difficult everything feels. But as you continue practicing, you begin noticing small improvements that were previously invisible. Your attention has become more sensitive to progress. The same principle can work with personal habits. If you begin paying attention to how often you become distracted, you may suddenly notice patterns that were always present. Perhaps you reach for your phone whenever a task becomes difficult. Perhaps you start unnecessary activities when you feel bored. Perhaps you avoid difficult work by convincing yourself that you need to prepare more. Awareness exposes the pattern. Once the pattern becomes visible, you can make a deliberate decision about what to do next. This is why awareness should lead to action. Simply observing yourself without changing anything can become another form of procrastination. The purpose of awareness is not endless self-analysis. It is to understand enough to make better choices. If you notice that certain environments consistently distract you, change the environment when possible. If you notice that you make poor decisions when emotionally overwhelmed, delay important decisions until you are calmer. If you notice that a particular habit repeatedly creates problems, design a practical system that makes the better behavior easier. Awareness becomes valuable when it produces responsible action. Another important concept is emotional distance. When a strong emotion appears, it can feel like the emotion represents the complete truth of the situation. Anger can make a problem seem larger. Fear can make a challenge appear impossible. Excitement can make an opportunity appear safer than it actually is. Taking a moment before acting can create enough distance to evaluate the situation more carefully. Ask: what am I feeling right now? What caused this reaction? What do I actually know? What am I assuming? What response would I respect later? These questions can prevent many impulsive decisions. Awareness also helps with relationships. People sometimes react to others based on old experiences rather than the current situation. A person may become defensive because a particular tone reminds them of a previous experience. Another may withdraw because disagreement feels threatening. Recognizing these patterns can improve communication. Instead of automatically reacting, you can explain what you are experiencing, ask for clarification, and give yourself time to understand the situation. This does not mean ignoring genuine problems. It means responding to the actual situation rather than allowing old patterns to control every new one. The deeper lesson is that self-awareness gives you more choice. Without awareness, thought can become reaction, reaction can become behavior, and behavior can become habit. With awareness, there is an opportunity to interrupt that sequence. You can notice the thought. You can examine the emotion. You can question the assumption. You can choose the response. And repeated choices can gradually become new habits. That is where awareness moves beyond an abstract idea and becomes a practical part of personal development. Awareness becomes more meaningful when we stop thinking of it as simply observing our thoughts and begin using it to understand the patterns that shape our everyday decisions. Many of our behaviors become automatic through repetition. We develop routines, reactions, expectations, and habits that can operate without much conscious attention. Some of these patterns are useful. Others may quietly hold us back. The challenge is that automatic behavior often feels normal simply because it is familiar. A person may constantly check their phone whenever they feel bored. Someone else may avoid difficult conversations because they fear disagreement. Another person may spend money impulsively whenever they feel stressed. Someone may repeatedly delay important work because starting it creates discomfort. The behavior may appear to be the problem, but awareness encourages us to look deeper. What happens immediately before the behavior? Perhaps boredom triggers distraction. Perhaps anxiety triggers avoidance. Perhaps stress triggers unnecessary spending. Perhaps fear of failure triggers procrastination. Once the trigger becomes visible, a person has a better opportunity to change the response. This is one of the most practical aspects of self-awareness. Instead of fighting the final behavior alone, examine the pattern that produces it. Imagine someone who regularly postpones an important task. They might tell themselves, "I need more motivation." But after observing their behavior carefully, they may discover that the task feels too large and unclear. The solution may not be finding extraordinary motivation. It may simply be breaking the task into smaller actions and beginning with one clear step. Awareness changes the problem from a vague personal criticism into something that can be addressed. Another important area is self-talk. People constantly interpret their own experiences through internal language. After making a mistake, someone might think, "I always ruin everything." Another person might think, "I made a mistake. What can I learn from it?" The event may be identical, but the interpretation is different. The first statement turns one mistake into a permanent identity. The second treats the mistake as information. This does not mean ignoring failure. Healthy self-awareness allows us to admit when we have acted poorly and take responsibility. But responsibility is different from unnecessarily attacking ourselves. A useful question is: Is the way I am describing this situation accurate, or am I turning one event into a judgment about my entire identity? That question can help create more balanced thinking. Awareness also helps us recognize emotional triggers. Some situations naturally produce stronger reactions than others. A person may become unusually defensive when criticized. Another may become anxious when plans change unexpectedly. Someone else may become impatient when they feel ignored. The reaction may feel automatic, but noticing the pattern gives us an opportunity to prepare. If you know that criticism triggers defensiveness, you can create a simple pause before responding. Instead of immediately explaining why the other person is wrong, you can first ask whether there is something useful in what they said. If a change in plans creates anxiety, you can remind yourself that uncertainty does not automatically mean danger. The goal is not to eliminate emotions. The goal is to prevent emotions from making every decision for you. This distinction is important because emotions are not enemies. They can provide information. Fear can signal that something deserves attention. Frustration can reveal that a need or expectation has not been met. Sadness can indicate that something meaningful has been lost. But emotional information still needs interpretation. Feeling afraid does not automatically mean that a situation is dangerous. Feeling confident does not automatically mean that a decision is wise. Feeling excited does not automatically mean that an opportunity is good. Awareness allows us to recognize the emotion while continuing to evaluate the facts. Another powerful lesson is examining expectations. People often become disappointed not only because of what happens, but because reality does not match what they expected. Suppose you expect someone to respond immediately to your message. When they do not, you may interpret the silence as disrespect. But perhaps they are busy, distracted, or dealing with something unrelated to you. The emotional reaction may have come from an assumption rather than confirmed information. Awareness asks us to separate what happened from the story we created about what happened. This is an extremely useful habit. Facts describe the event. Interpretations describe what we believe the event means. Keeping these two things separate can reduce unnecessary conflict. The same principle applies to personal goals. People sometimes create expectations that are so extreme that normal progress feels like failure. For example, someone may decide they must completely change their habits immediately. When they inevitably struggle, they conclude that they cannot change. A more realistic approach is to observe progress over time. Sustainable improvement often comes from repeated adjustments rather than one dramatic transformation. Awareness helps us recognize what is actually working. It also encourages reflection after important experiences. At the end of a difficult day, instead of simply thinking, "Today was terrible," ask specific questions. What went well? What created difficulty? What did I assume? How did I respond? What could I handle differently next time? What did I learn? This type of reflection turns experience into information. Over time, these observations can reveal patterns that are difficult to notice in the middle of daily life. Perhaps you discover that you make poor decisions when tired. Perhaps you perform better when you plan the night before. Perhaps certain environments consistently distract you. Perhaps particular conversations become difficult when you enter them without enough preparation. Once these patterns are known, you can make practical adjustments. This is why awareness should not become an excuse for endless thinking. Observe. Understand. Adjust. Act. That cycle is more useful than constantly analyzing yourself without changing anything. Another important point is that awareness should include awareness of strengths, not only weaknesses. Some people become so focused on their mistakes that they overlook the abilities they already possess. Recognizing strengths can help a person use them more effectively. Maybe you communicate well, learn quickly, remain patient under pressure, solve problems creatively, or work consistently when you have a clear structure. Knowing your strengths allows you to build on them while still improving your weaknesses. Balanced self-awareness means seeing yourself honestly, not as perfect and not as hopeless. It means recognizing both capability and limitation. Ultimately, the deeper lesson is that awareness gives us a clearer picture of the connection between triggers, thoughts, emotions, habits, and actions. When those connections become visible, automatic behavior becomes easier to question. And once you can question a pattern, you have a greater opportunity to decide whether you want to continue it. That is where awareness becomes a form of personal responsibility, not controlling everything that happens, but becoming more deliberate about what you do with what happens. Awareness becomes truly useful when it begins to influence the way we live, work, communicate, and make decisions. Recognizing our thoughts is only the beginning. The greater challenge is learning how to respond to those thoughts with discipline rather than allowing every passing feeling to determine our actions. One of the most important areas where awareness matters is decision-making. Every day, we make decisions based on incomplete information. Some choices are small, while others can affect our education, career, finances, relationships, and future responsibilities. In these situations, our emotions, assumptions, habits, and previous experiences can quietly influence the way we judge our options. Awareness helps us slow down enough to examine those influences. Before making an important decision, ask yourself: what do I actually know? What am I assuming? What emotion am I experiencing right now? Am I choosing this because it is genuinely useful, or because I feel pressured? What could happen if my assumption is wrong? These questions do not guarantee a perfect decision. They simply make the decision more deliberate. Another important principle is learning to recognize mental shortcuts. People naturally look for familiar patterns. If something resembles a previous experience, we may assume that the outcome will be similar. Sometimes this is useful. Other times it can lead us to incorrect conclusions. For example, one disappointing experience with a person does not prove that everyone will behave the same way. One unsuccessful attempt does not prove that future attempts will fail. One criticism does not automatically define your ability. Awareness helps separate past experience from present reality. The past can teach us, but it should not automatically control every future decision. Another important area is communication. When conversations become emotional, people often listen only to defend themselves. They are already preparing their next argument while the other person is speaking. Awareness can interrupt this pattern. What is the main concern? What information are they trying to communicate? What emotion might be influencing the conversation? What part of their message can be acknowledged even if you disagree with their conclusion? This does not require surrendering your own position. It simply creates better conditions for constructive communication. Awareness also helps with conflict. When disagreements occur, the first reaction may be to prove that the other person is wrong. But winning an argument is not always the same as solving the problem. A more useful question may be: what outcome would actually improve this situation? Sometimes the answer is clarification. Sometimes it is an apology. Sometimes it is a boundary. Sometimes it is simply accepting that two people see the issue differently. Awareness allows us to choose the response based on the actual goal rather than the temporary desire to win. Another important lesson is recognizing the influence of environment. People often try to change their behavior through willpower alone while keeping the same surroundings that encourage the old habit. If distractions are always within reach, staying focused becomes harder. If unhealthy routines are built into the daily schedule, changing them requires greater effort. If your environment constantly encourages unnecessary spending, disciplined financial decisions may become more difficult. Awareness helps identify these environmental influences. Once you recognize them, you can make practical changes. Move distractions away when working. Create routines that support your goals. Make useful behavior easier to repeat. This is not about creating a perfect environment. It is about making responsible choices more convenient. Another important area is attention management. Attention is limited. What receives your attention repeatedly can influence what you notice and what you ignore. If you spend large amounts of time consuming information designed to create fear, anger, or constant comparison, your mental environment can become exhausting. Awareness encourages you to ask, is this information helping me understand something, or is it simply consuming my attention? This question is increasingly important because modern technology makes it easy to move from one piece of information to another without realizing how much time has passed. Protecting attention can therefore become part of personal discipline. Another valuable lesson is being intentional about your goals. A goal becomes more useful when it is connected to a clear reason. Instead of simply saying, "I want to become successful," define what success means in practical terms. Perhaps success means becoming highly skilled in a profession, completing an education, building a responsible business, supporting family responsibilities, or becoming more disciplined in everyday life. Clarity matters because vague goals create vague actions. Awareness can help identify whether your daily behavior actually supports your stated priorities. If someone says education is important but spends most available study time distracted, the problem is not necessarily a lack of ambition. There may be a mismatch between intention and behavior. Awareness reveals the mismatch. Another important lesson is accepting responsibility without believing you control everything. There will always be circumstances outside your control. Other people will make their own decisions. Unexpected events will happen. Some outcomes will be disappointing even when you make a reasonable effort. Awareness helps distinguish between responsibility and control. You are responsible for your choices. You are not responsible for controlling every outcome. This distinction can reduce unnecessary frustration while encouraging personal accountability. Another useful practice is reviewing important decisions after the outcome becomes known. If a decision worked, ask why. If it failed, ask what information was missing. Avoid judging the decision only by its result. A thoughtful decision can sometimes produce a bad outcome because of circumstances that could not reasonably have been predicted. Likewise, a careless decision can sometimes produce a good result by luck. Evaluating the quality of the decision-making process is more useful than simply judging the final result. This creates a habit of continuous learning. Awareness also encourages humility. The more we examine our own thinking, the more we recognize how easily assumptions can influence us. That realization should not create insecurity. It should create curiosity. Instead of saying, "I already know exactly why this happened," ask, "What might I be missing?" That simple question can improve learning, relationships, and decision-making. Ultimately, awareness is not about becoming perfectly calm, perfectly positive, or perfectly rational. Human beings will experience emotions, make mistakes, misunderstand situations, and sometimes react poorly. The goal is to become better at noticing what is happening, taking responsibility for our response, learning from experience, and making the next decision more deliberately. That is where awareness becomes practical. It moves from something we think about into something we practice. As awareness becomes part of everyday life, an important transformation begins to take place. Instead of simply reacting to whatever happens, we start becoming more deliberate about how we respond. This does not mean that life suddenly becomes easy. Difficult situations will still happen. People will still disagree with us. Plans will still change. Mistakes will still occur. The difference is that awareness gives us a better opportunity to meet those situations with clarity rather than automatic reaction. One of the strongest applications of awareness is emotional self-control. When an emotion becomes intense, it can feel as though immediate action is necessary. Anger can create the urge to respond immediately. Fear can encourage avoidance. Excitement can encourage impulsive decisions. Disappointment can make a temporary problem feel permanent. Awareness creates a pause. That pause can be very small, but it can be valuable. Instead of asking only, "What do I feel like doing right now?" ask, what response will actually help this situation? This question moves attention from immediate emotion toward consequences. Suppose someone says something offensive. The first reaction may be to respond with equally harsh words. But if you pause, you may realize that the response could create a much larger conflict. Perhaps the better choice is to clarify what was meant, establish a boundary, or step away until the conversation becomes calmer. The emotion has not disappeared. You have simply chosen not to let it make the decision for you. This is an important distinction. Emotional control does not mean emotional suppression. Suppressing emotions means pretending they are not there. Awareness means recognizing them and deciding how to respond responsibly. Another important lesson is understanding habit formation. Repeated actions become easier to perform over time. This can work for both useful and harmful behaviors. If you repeatedly delay important work, delay becomes familiar. If you repeatedly organize your tasks before beginning, preparation becomes familiar. If you repeatedly react immediately when frustrated, impulsive responses can become your default. Awareness allows you to identify which behaviors are being reinforced. Once you recognize a habit, you can begin changing the conditions around it. Make useful behavior easier. Make distractions less accessible. Create clear routines. Start with manageable actions. Review your progress regularly. The objective is not perfection. It is repetition. Small responsible actions become more powerful when they are repeated consistently. Another important application is relationships. People sometimes enter relationships carrying assumptions from previous experiences. If someone has been disappointed before, they may expect disappointment again. If someone has experienced criticism, they may become unusually sensitive to feedback. Awareness helps separate past experiences from present relationships. Instead of automatically thinking, this person is going to treat me the same way, ask, what has this person actually done? That question encourages evidence-based judgment. It does not require ignoring warning signs. If someone's behavior repeatedly demonstrates dishonesty or disrespect, awareness should help you recognize that pattern. But awareness also protects against judging people solely through assumptions. This balance is important. Another lesson is understanding your own values. Without clear values, decisions can easily be driven by pressure, popularity, convenience, or temporary emotion. Ask yourself what principles matter most to you. Do you value honesty, responsibility, family, learning, discipline, kindness, fairness? Once your values are clearer, decisions become easier to evaluate. A decision may be profitable but still inconsistent with your principles. Another choice may be difficult but more aligned with the person you want to become. Awareness helps bring this conflict into the open. This is especially important when facing social pressure. People often make choices because they want approval. They may buy things they do not need, follow trends they do not actually value, or agree with opinions they have not carefully considered. Awareness allows you to ask, do I genuinely want this, or do I simply want to be accepted? Another important lesson is learning from mistakes without becoming trapped by them. Everyone makes mistakes. The useful question is not whether you have made mistakes, but what you do afterward. A mistake can become a source of information. What happened? What role did I play? What could I have noticed earlier? What should I do differently next time? What lesson can I carry forward? This approach creates growth without requiring unnecessary self-condemnation. Awareness also means recognizing when you need help. Sometimes a problem is too complicated to solve alone. A trusted teacher, mentor, parent, professional, or knowledgeable person may provide useful perspective. Asking for guidance does not reduce personal responsibility. It can strengthen it by helping you make a more informed decision. Another powerful idea is being aware of limitations. Self-awareness includes knowing what you do not know. A person who believes they understand everything becomes less likely to learn. A person who recognizes gaps in their knowledge can ask better questions and seek better information. Humility therefore becomes part of awareness. The more carefully you observe yourself, the more you may discover that your thinking is influenced by habits, experiences, emotions, and assumptions. Recognizing this should not make you distrust every thought. It should encourage you to examine important thoughts before acting on them. This creates a balanced approach. Notice the thought. Examine the evidence. Recognize the emotion. Consider the consequences. Choose the response. Over time, this process can become more natural. The deeper lesson is that personal development is not about becoming a completely different person overnight. It is about becoming more conscious of the person you already are and making better choices from that awareness. You may not control every circumstance. You may not control other people's actions. You may not be able to predict every outcome. But you can continue improving your ability to observe, reflect, learn, and respond responsibly. That is the practical value of awareness. It gives you a moment between impulse and action. And sometimes, that moment is exactly where better decisions begin. As we reach the end of this educational summary of The Power of Awareness by Neville Goddard, one central lesson remains: greater awareness can lead to greater responsibility for the way we think, respond, and act. Throughout this journey, we explored awareness not as a promise of supernatural results, but as a practical way of understanding ourselves more clearly. We began with a simple question: how much of our daily behavior is conscious, and how much is automatic? That question can change the way we look at everyday life. A thought appears. An emotion follows. An assumption influences our interpretation. Then a reaction becomes an action. When the same pattern is repeated, it can eventually become a habit. Awareness gives us an opportunity to notice that sequence. Instead of immediately reacting, we can pause. Instead of accepting every thought as fact, we can examine it. Instead of blaming every circumstance, we can ask what part of the situation is actually within our control. This is one of the most practical lessons from the entire discussion. Awareness does not mean controlling everything. It means becoming more conscious of your own choices. We also explored the relationship between thoughts and behavior. Our thoughts can influence how we interpret situations, what we notice, and how we respond. But a thought is not automatically a fact, and positive thinking alone does not guarantee a particular external result. This distinction is important. A healthy approach is to examine our thoughts honestly, compare them with evidence, recognize emotional influences, and then choose actions that are responsible and realistic. We also discussed emotional self-control. Anger, fear, disappointment, excitement, and anxiety can all influence decisions. The goal is not to eliminate emotions. Emotions are part of being human. The goal is to create enough space between feeling and action that we can choose our response more carefully. Sometimes that means waiting before sending a message. Sometimes it means asking for clarification. Sometimes it means stepping away from an argument. Sometimes it means admitting that we were wrong. These small decisions can have significant consequences over time. Another major lesson was the importance of recognizing patterns. If you repeatedly procrastinate, become defensive, spend impulsively, lose patience, or avoid difficult responsibilities, awareness allows you to examine what happens before the behavior. What triggered it? What were you thinking? What emotion appeared? What did you do next? What result followed? Once a pattern becomes visible, you have a better opportunity to change it. We also explored the importance of understanding our values. When your priorities are unclear, decisions can easily be influenced by social pressure, temporary emotions, or the desire for approval. Clear values can provide direction. They help you ask not only, what do I want right now, but also, what kind of person do I want to become? That question can influence decisions about education, work, relationships, money, habits, and personal responsibility. Another important lesson is humility. Self-awareness does not mean believing that you understand everything about yourself or everyone around you. In fact, becoming more aware often reveals how easily assumptions can influence our thinking. That realization should encourage learning rather than insecurity. Ask questions. Seek reliable information. Admit uncertainty when necessary. Learn from people with relevant knowledge and experience. Awareness becomes stronger when combined with humility. We also discussed the importance of turning awareness into action. Knowing that a habit is harmful does not automatically change it. Understanding that preparation matters does not mean we will always prepare. Recognizing that patience is valuable does not mean we will never become impatient. Real growth requires practice. Observe. Understand. Adjust. Act. Repeat. That process may look ordinary, but repeated over time it can create meaningful personal improvement. And there is another important lesson: you are not required to become perfect. The purpose of self-awareness is not to constantly criticize yourself or search for flaws. It is to understand yourself accurately enough to make better choices. You will still make mistakes. You will still experience difficult emotions. You will sometimes misunderstand people. You will sometimes choose poorly. The ideas discussed in this summary have been intentionally presented through a practical and responsible lens. Concepts that conflict with Islamic beliefs have not been included as teachings to follow. The focus has remained on self-awareness, personal responsibility, emotional discipline, reflection, learning, and thoughtful decision-making. Ultimately, awareness gives us something extremely valuable. A chance to pause before reacting. A chance to question an assumption. A chance to correct a mistake. A chance to choose a better response. And a chance to become more intentional about the person we are becoming. So the next time you experience a strong emotion, face a difficult decision, repeat an unwanted habit, or find yourself making an automatic assumption, pause for a moment and ask: what is happening inside me right now? What do I actually know? What am I assuming? And what response would be most responsible? You may not control everything that happens in life. But you can continue developing awareness of your own thoughts, choices, and actions. And sometimes, meaningful change begins with something as simple as noticing. Thank you for joining me for this complete educational summary of the power of awareness. Keep learning. Keep reflecting. Keep improving. And above all, use awareness to become more responsible, thoughtful, and deliberate in the way you live your life.